every moment is meaningful in a certain way, even when it is something you want to forget or you want to move away from. But all these things kind of add up and accumulate to shape who you are. And it's also connected to this idea. I actually was just giving a commencement address at a university and was talking about this concept of nothing is wasted, right? Even when you think something is kind of like taking you off track or you don't know where you're going, all those pieces are meaningful and you're kind of building different sorts of assets along the way. And so all of that work that you do internally is sort of like the fodder for future work. I have a pastor who calls it sort of the manure for life, right? Like even when it's terrible,
oh, that's good,
right? And I won't cuss on your podcast, but even when it's the S word, it's productive.
Yes.
Today, on the Road to Ambition podcast, Ambition Angels CEO Remi talks with Dr. Michelle Weise, esteemed author of Long Life Learning, Preparing for Jobs That Don't Even Exist Yet. Dr. Weise's work focuses on the evolving landscape of work and education and emphasizes the need for a new learning ecosystem to support continuous learning. Right up our alley. Let's get into it.
All right, Michelle, thank you again for joining. This is a really exciting interview for me. I was telling you when we popped on that I feel like I'm fanboying because I spent some weeks feeling like you were talking to me, right? Because I was reading your book. You don't know me, but I know you. And it's cool because that book came at the exact right time for our organization. Like we were just many mentors and people we're talking to were telling us how much what we're doing is related to workforce development and starting to think like, man, curate some of this stuff to really guide them into work. And so I was like, look, we're in youth development. I'm comfortable with education. That's not really my space. And so I was like, I need to start reading some books, talk to a bunch of folks. And your book kept coming up. And then I spoke with a colleague of yours and she said, this is the book you need to read. And I got it on Amazon that day, started reading it. And it just was like hitting on all cylinders. And really anyone who's raising any kid needs to be tapped into what's happening in the work, in the field right now, across work, and what the future of work needs to look like. So I'm really excited for this conversation.
Oh my goodness. What an amazing thing to say. And I'm just so glad it's been helpful and useful to you.
Yeah. All right. Well, we want to kind of bring, before we get into what you're studying and what you think about and write about and work on, I want the audience really just to get to know you a little bit. And as a youth developer, I think about every kid and I imagine them as an adult. I look at every adult and I imagine them as kids. And so because we're focused specifically on teens, I would love for you to bring us into the world, into your life a little bit by starting with you as a 15-year-old. Tell us about Michelle, the 15-year-old, and the journey you've had to now.
Yeah, 15 is actually a really interesting age because it was the first time I was dealing with a death of someone I knew. My chemistry teacher in high school actually died of AIDS in the middle of the year. And it was incredibly hard to watch him deteriorate in front of our eyes. And what was amazing about that entire sort of experience is it exposed me to a lot of pain and hurt and all these different feelings of really seeing someone I knew closely pass away. But it also helped me figure out how to process some of those emotions. And so as a 15-year-old, I actually retreated to the power of poetry. And I started to write my first poems on my own. And that was a way I was trying to kind of make sense of what I was going through. And also understand like how words can really, move me to a different kind of place of healing. So it was really fascinating to kind of that you even brought up the number 15, because that to me is like a really it was like a very formative time in my life. And actually that kind of ended up sort of leading towards a trajectory that really consumed me for a long time. I ended up
Mm.
studying literature and languages in high school and college. Like in college, it was my major as a comparative literature person. And then I ended up getting a PhD in English literature to
Wow.
be an English professor where I taught poetry and fiction. And I taught Asian American poetry and fiction, and any sort of ethnic American fiction and poetry. And that really was kind of like a huge portion of my life. I don't do that work anymore, but
Hmm.
it really kind of set me on a certain trajectory of, this is what I love. This is what consumes me. This is what really moves me. And I want
Yeah.
more of it in my life.
Wow.
But it was that one moment of like real intense pain.
Wow. That's an intense thing for a 15-year-old to go through. And this wasn't this wasn't just like a relationship you had with this teacher. Multiple kids had relationship with this teacher, and I have to imagine that not every kid found solace in the beauty of poetry,
Right.
right? So some
Yeah.
kids, right, like you happened upon that, and I'm glad you did for your own healing. Were there other kids who because the reason I bring that up is because grief is one of those things that is kind of a ubiquitous and universal experience, but that's never really taught how to deal with.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I've watched time and time again students lose somebody in their family, even a grandparent who was aging, and because they were not prepared for it at all, it threw them completely off and set them back in their studies. And it caused this kind of spiral downward. And I was like, man, this is so to hear you talk about that is, I think, really relevant. Are there other kids in your class who you felt like didn't necessarily process that in the right way?
Yeah. I mean, I think I might have processed it deeply just because I was kind of like a highly sensitive person, and I could see
Mm,
him, and I was wondering what was going on, and there was so much confusion around it. I
mm,
think, other kids maybe deflected it a little bit more, or just
yeah,
maybe pushed it away. I think what's really fascinating though is I grew up, and I think probably you grew up in a time where we just didn't have as many devices. We didn't have any. We didn't
yeah,
have anything to kind of turn to and distract ourselves. And uh, I think there was also a real emphasis at my school in the arts. And I feel like that helps. If you can't express your emotions verbally, and if you can't communicate the pain or grief you're feeling, you can at least find a different outlet for it and express it
right,
in that way. Right.
right,
And so I
right,
feel like it probably came out in different avenues for people, whether it was through
yeah,
woodwork or music or, whatever the thing may be. For me, it just happened to be writing.
right,
But I wonder how children today, process when there is something that can kind of turn them away from processing, right? And getting distracted away from that moment, or finding also, like, I think we're just used to also not having as much stimulation. So you could
yeah,
rest in that discomfort and quiet
yes,
a little bit
yes.
longer.
Wow. Oh man, I mean, you're speaking to some really powerful things that I'm sure you didn't think you were going to talk about today. But I just have to sit on that for a second, because what you're talking about is almost the beauty of these human experiences, however painful, and the importance of them in shaping and allowing, like, so much of the beautiful things that have been created from that place of pain. But
Hmm.
when there's so much access now to distraction,
Yep.
right, and consumption, where's the moment for inspiration and for creation that comes? And so it's a valid kind of worry about what technology might be doing to this generation. Like, you're
Yeah.
speaking to that tension a little bit, right?
Yeah. It's also
Yeah.
this thing of like everything counts, right? Like every moment is meaningful in a certain way, even when it is something you want to forget, or you want to move away from. But all these things kind of add up and accumulate to shape who you are. And it's also connected to this idea. I actually was just giving a commencement address at a university and was talking about this concept of nothing is wasted, right? Even when
Mm,
you think something is kind of like
mm,
taking you off track, or you don't know where
yeah.
you're going,
Yep.
all those pieces are meaningful, and you're kind of building different sorts of assets along the way. And so all of that all of that work that you do internally is sort of like the fodder for future work. It's I have a pastor who calls it sort of the manure for life, right? Like even
Yeah.
when it's
Yeah. Oh, that's
terrible,
good.
right? And I won't cuss on your podcast, but even when it's the S
Yeah.
word,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
productive.
Yes. Yes. I like that. Okay. So obviously I'm imagining Michelle, the 15-year-old, highly sensitive, artistically expressive, probably observant and really thoughtful, and you kind of live in your head, and then from that place you create. You're probably okay being on your own a little bit,
Mm,
and that space. Okay, so I think I understand that, and that makes sense. I'm positive though that along the way there were mentors as well who really helped guide you. Can you speak a little bit to, and the reason why I think this is important, because somebody sees a Michelle Weise, accomplished researcher and author and all of this, and we forget that she was a 15-year-old once who someone saw potential in and helped invest in. And so can you talk
mhm.
a little bit about, we call them ambition angels, people, angel investors who saw
Yeah.
potential before it was realized and said, this is worth investing in. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've had so many ambition angels in my
Mm,
life. I've been really lucky. I've had it's kind of what made me want to go into the field of academia, is like I wanted other people to feel similarly lifted up from those kinds of interactions with
mm,
teachers and instructors and professors. But actually, in that same year, when I was 15, I was going through a really hard time where I loved writing, I loved literature, and the teacher I was learning from really didn't like anything I was producing. Like really it was almost like I
mm,
felt like I was in another world, where I would say something in a discussion and she wouldn't kind of acknowledge it, and then someone would say almost exactly the same thing and she would give them lots of praise and adulation, and in my head I was just thinking, I'm pretty
mm.
sure I just said the same thing, and
Wow. Yep.
everything I would write would kind of come back with poor grades. And I thought, what does this mean that I love to write, but I'm not getting affirmed in this thing that I love to do, right? Or maybe I'm a terrible writer. And it really affected me for that entire year. It kind of ruined my self-esteem, and also made me question like what I was doing and what I loved. But I had I had a teacher the following year, and he was incredible. Like he made us read like our first paragraphs out loud when we would have to write an essay,
Mm,
and so we would
mm,
all have to go around the class and read. And he would just get so genuinely excited about what we were producing. And then for me personally, he was kind of effusive and helpful and encouraging, and just made me
mm,
see that I do have potential, and he just gave me that gift of
mm.
feeling enthusiastic again about something that I
Yep.
loved.
Yep.
And that was amazing as like kind of a starting point. Another person along the way was a professor when I was at Harvard, and he was like a famous professor, and he gave me the time. He had filled up his office hours. Everyone wanted to come speak with him, and he ran out of time, and he saw me sitting in the hallway, and he was so apologetic because he realized I was there, but I didn't get to talk with him. And he said,
Mm,
I have to go, but come back at this time and I will meet with you. And he gave
mm,
me a full hour of his time. And during that conversation, I was telling him how much I loved poetry. And I was trying to get onto this literary magazine at the school. And I just found the whole process a little hard and daunting, and just elitist a little bit. Like I felt out of place. I didn't feel comfortable. I didn't feel 100% like welcome. And I was saying, I'm reading, like we're doing this whole thing of reading all these poems, and then we're tossing out 90% of them and then publishing a few poems, and then it's all the friends of the people who are editors of the magazine. It's kind of this echo chamber of poetry. And I was saying, I think I would want to start a new magazine just to like bring some of that new perspective in,
mm,
bring in different language poetry, kind of run. And I ended up calling this magazine The Gamut, because it was like
mm.
really a range of voices.
Yep.
And I hadn't started it at the time. I was just sort of saying, like, I think I kind of should start something. And he pulled out his wallet He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and just put it on the table. And he said, go start it. Go do it.
Wow.
It was the most
Mm.
incredible kind of experience. And I did. I started the magazine and it continued after I left the university. But he was the push of just sort of saying, like, I believe in you. Try it. Go do it. Here's some money. Just start it. Like, run with it.
I
Um,
I
yeah.
love that story. Like as a youth developer, um, I'm highly sensitive to the power of these moments, especially the younger we are, right? The more formative years we're in, these moments matter so much. And so I really hope our listeners like hear that and think about like the value of providing that moment where you're breathing confidence and you're
Yep.
not just talking, but they actually put their money where their mouth is, right? And said, look, I'm gonna actually invest real $100.
Yes.
And it's funny because we're doing these 30-day simulated internships on the course, and students get $100. And that is exactly the
Really.
point: is invest in them, tell them no, their time and their value is worth it. We believe in you, we need you. And so I wonder if if that person in your life knows where you're at today, and knows that, like, because that would be so special.
Yeah, he does. He's amazing. So it was funny. When I was graduating, all the potential grads are lined up along the aisles, and then the professors sort of march through.
Yeah.
And I waved at him as he walked by,
Yeah.
and he waved, and then he kind of went up another like 100 feet, and then he ran back and just gave me a bear hug and
That's
said,
awesome.
"It's the poet from Pasadena."
I love
Um,
it.
And
That's
then amazingly, when I was a college professor, I got to introduce him to the audience
Yeah.
because he remembered me and wanted me to introduce him to the faculty, like to the entire audience. And so it was like full circle. It was this incredible, just sort of
it's awesome.
journey. And it all started kind of with him.
I love that story. Okay, so I don't know that people would say now Michelle Weiss, the poet from Pasadena, right?
No.
So if somebody were to come up to you today, and now we've kind of walked through your story a little bit, and it's an interesting one. It's not one that necessarily has this logical ending with where you're at right now, right?
Yeah.
So, but if somebody were to ask and say, "Hey, Michelle, like, what do you do? What do you work on? What are you trying to accomplish in the world?" How would you explain that now?
I think it's a lot connected to my own sort of spaghetti noodle pathway. And that's how I kind of
Mm,
describe this. It's my pathway is not linear. It's not like I started here,
yep.
and I'm
Yep.
ending here. It has been lots of twists and turns that were not anticipated and not planned. But
Mm,
in general, what I call myself now is either an author or a consultant.
hmm.
And so, but it takes me a while to kind of explain to folks what it is that I do.
Right.
So right now, what I'm doing is helping all kinds of businesses and higher ed institutions essentially think about strategies to shape the future for their working age learners. So that
Hmm.
could be someone coming out of high school. It could be a 45, 55-year-old potentially transitioning into a new form of work. But
Hmm.
essentially, like my life has been about, after leaving academia, has been about this concept of translating skills into the language of the labor market. So
Mm,
I started off my career helping service members transition out of the military into civilian careers. And
mm,
what was fascinating is that service members or veterans coming out with this vast experience were kind of only seeing a couple of opportunities ahead for themselves. They could see themselves in security, right? And these kind of more sort of policing sorts of roles. It was hard for them to think kind of more widely about what they could do in the future. And that's kind of been the case for everything I've done since. I've kind of worked on what I would just sort of call more underestimated learner populations. These are people
hmm.
who often maybe have little more than a high school degree. They might
Hmm.
have some college, they might have none, but they're struggling to find their way in the labor market. They're struggling to find their footing,
Yep.
um, and and our education and workforce infrastructure isn't there to really support and help people who are struggling or not earning a living wage to kind of have that mobility that they're seeking. And so all my work is kind of since that sort of switch out of academia has been about opening up more pathways of
Mm,
visibility to people to sort of understand, like, no, you can actually move in this direction even though you don't see yourself there. Like, let me show you how your skills translate, and then here's how you make the case to a future employer.
mm,
And then now it's also connecting sort of this very uncertain world of work ahead due to technological advancements, especially AI. How do
mhm,
we actually prepare people, whether that's from a curricular level? How do we prepare learners with the right kinds of things to learn? What kinds of skills do they need, both human and technological
mhm.
skills? And then what kinds of opportunities need to exist within the workforce to allow people to sort of find the path that is sort of most authentic to them.
Yeah.
So it's been a lot of this work, but it's wordy. But that's what
Yeah.
I do in consulting.
No,
I
no, I
help
love it. I love
organizations.
it. I mean, because it sounds to me like you're looking at this. You obviously see the role of work in human flourishing, right? Like
Yes.
we're doing that for a majority of our days, for a majority of our week, for a majority of our life. So I'm sure you have a passion for wanting to see that thrive, and you see kind of two elements. There's the individual person and the
Mhm.
agency they have to say, I need to invest in my skills to make sure that I'm constantly learning. Um, and then there's a role on the other side of the workforce itself to make learning more accessible, to make consistent growth more accessible to their, because they'll benefit from it, right? And so
Yes.
I'm curious if you can speak to, and maybe things have changed with AI, and you can speak to that as well. But I'm sure that there are some like universal skills that you have seen most important for folks to build
Mhm.
for success in the workplace?
Yeah. So one of the most important skills is one of these things that I call a human skill, and that's to sort of distinguish it as separate from something that could potentially become automated in the future.
Mm,
And one of those human skills that I find most critical is self awareness.
mm,
And what I mean by that is being able to read people's nonverbal cues and gestures to understand how you're coming off to them. It's really hard and
it's
it takes
really hard.
practice.
Yeah.
And we're losing out on the practice by being on devices for so long. There's literally like a physical limbic resonance that happens when we're in person to each other and we have kind of closeness and proximity to help
Hmm.
foster connection. When we're on devices, it becomes a lot harder, or
Yeah.
just a lot harder for us to read each other's
Yeah.
faces.
Yes.
And I've been kind of fascinated by this idea that we have 40 different muscles in our face that make up to 10,000 different expressions. It's the research
Wow.
of Paul Ekman. And he talks about how we as humans can read about 3,000 of them because they're emotion projecting. But if you think about kind of where our young people are today, they need more opportunities to get access to reading those kinds of expressions, because it's so easy to retreat and revert to a device when you're uncomfortable,
Mm,
nervous, or you don't feel socially comfortable. But we have to kind of understand what that physical and the responses that we're getting from other people, and we have to have that awareness to adjust our own behavior to be
yes.
more productive as a team player, right? And
Right.
I think that's one big piece. Another one that's really fascinating that comes out of MIT research is that one of the biggest things, the keys to productivity on a team, is just when people can speak and listen in equal measure. That's it. It's like
Mm,
taking turns. And it's amazing how little that happens when you're in the workplace. Like, you see that there are certain folks who are more vocal, and they're not listening maybe because they are too vocal. So it's this idea of trying to take and learn, and then also explore with other groups and not be siloed in your own team. Find
hmm.
other teams to gather new information, bring it back, spread it amongst your team, and socialize and break down silos within.
Hmm.
That is kind of another piece of that research. But it's so interesting, right? It's just like basic
Yeah.
human skills. But then
Yep.
when you think about your encounters every day, it's like, oh yeah, that person can't do that.
Yeah, we're all thinking about that one person who can't do that.
Yeah.
Like airtime. So all right, so the airtime situation makes sense to me, and I always process these concepts and think about my kids. We're homeschooling, so we have a lot of agency to teach our kids what it is we think are the most important skills. We're youth developers in our community, and all the way from and I say we, me, my wife and I, and then within ambition, we're thinking about literally trying to take some of these hard to translate skills and communicate them to kids so they can learn.
Mhm.
And so that concept of watching your airtime and taking turns makes sense. Even I can have a visual of how to teach that. The self-awareness piece, though,
Mhm.
I wonder how much of that is nature versus nurture. And in the nurture piece, people who are hyper self aware, how does one teach someone how to become more self aware?
It's a good question. I think what we you don't actually need like high fidelity ways of doing this. Like you can actually do very simple computer based simulations, even
Mm-hmm.
um, to have animated figures in front of you and to
Mm-hmm.
look at those figures and say, I wonder what emotion they're feeling right now based on the way they're positioned, the way their hand
Good.
is, the way their eyes look. Um, it's those sorts of things of being able to sort of look at something and instantaneously kind of think, what is this person like, what mindset is this person potentially in, and that you can practice. They even have a really interesting test called the seeing the eyes test, where even from people's eyes you should be able to kind of read some sort of emotion from their facial expression of just looking at their eyes, even without looking at their mouth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so those are also kinds of ways in which we can sort of get a little bit more keyed in and clued in to what others might be feeling, because it's important to understand how we come off in the workplace to others, right? And
Yes.
how our communication style, maybe there's something about our tone that needs to be adjusted. There's
Mm.
something that might be rubbing people in a certain way. And you need to be aware of that, because otherwise your ability to be productive and to share your work
Yep. Yep.
get that next promotion depends,
Yep.
unfortunately, on a lot of these factors.
Yes.
So you need to, this is something you're not just born with. I think this is a mistake about human skills, is that we think,
Mm.
oh, we all have human skills because we're not
Yeah.
computers, and
Yeah.
computers can't exercise judgment in the same way, or they can't do systems thinking in the same way. All of that takes practice. We are
Mm.
not sophisticated at these human skills. That's why we can all think of the people who lack these human skills,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Because they just haven't maybe had the right feedback. Even
Yeah.
taking feedback is a huge piece of that
Yes.
process, right? And being
Yes.
able to internalize it and say, how can I potentially change my behavior without
Yeah.
changing myself necessarily,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
understand what needs to potentially be altered to have more success in the future.
That's really good. Yeah. And I imagine that speaks to the importance of mentors, the kind of one to
Yes.
one feedback, right? Like it's hard to put that on a teacher who's managing 30 kids or even a manager who's managing multiple folks to always give you that feedback, like somebody who really knows you and is in a position to give you some feedback on how you're coming off to people.
Yeah.
Like that is highly, highly valuable feedback. So I appreciate that. So I want to take us. Okay, so that's on the kind of micro level on an individual basis. Now let's step into the world of workforce development more broadly,
Mm.
right? Um, I'm here in Silicon Valley, working in a community called East Palo Alto. I don't know if you know about East Palo Alto,
Yeah.
California. That's where we're at. And as a youth developer working here for 15 years, I'm hyper keyed in on this city and this area and how to help these kids succeed in this. But now we're serving kids nationwide, and we have to start thinking about national trends. And that's one of the things that really stood out to me was you were not just speaking to tech roles,
Mhm.
right? Like you were thinking about workforce development more broadly. And so I would love for you to just speak to some of the trends that you're seeing in the workforce development space that we might not know about, but that, and if you can speak to some relevance it has even to teens or Black and brown teens more specifically.
Yeah, so I know East Palo Alto well. I actually went to Stanford for grad school, so
Oh, nice. There you go. Yeah, yep,
spent a
yep.
fair
Go
amount of
Cards.
time in that
Yep.
area. And it's wonderful work that you're doing. I think the one thing I would say that is maybe less understood and
Mm,
really helpful for your learner population as well is I happen to advise a nonprofit startup that helps first generation minority learners kind of transition a little bit more smoothly from college into the
mm,
workforce. They're
mm.
trying to help them get sort of a better first job because the first job matters a lot in terms
Yes.
of accumulating wealth later, right?
Yes.
And
Hmm.
sort of starting off right so that you can have choices in the
Hmm.
future. And they do this amazing diagnostic assessment where they've asked thousands of their first generation minority learners to sort of talk about their different sorts of drivers, motivations, where they think they want to go. And so there have been some really interesting insights out of that data about motivations and drivers and alignment, as well as kind of clarity,
Mm,
clarity of like where you want to go. So I'll just talk
mm,
about that briefly.
hmm.
One huge thing is that the biggest, the biggest sort of unlock here is this thing called exposure. Exposure
Hmm.
is kind of critical to getting our young people, especially, to be exposed to as many jobs and industries as they can. Like if you think
Mm.
about when we grew up, I only knew about 4 jobs. I
Yeah,
knew that
that's
there
right.
was something called a teacher, there
Yep.
was a business person, there was a
Right.
lawyer, there was a
Yep.
doctor, right? Like
Yep.
those were the
Yep. Yep.
kinds of things I knew
Yeah.
about. I didn't know
Yeah, that's right.
what other jobs exist. But we know that there are thousands of jobs that are out there today
Yes.
that we don't even have the names for. We don't know that's actually critical for this thing to be successful. And we as people just need, even adults, just need to
Yeah.
understand what kinds of jobs are there, right? And so it's being exposed to a wide variety of industries and jobs. And what we found out is that when a young person has both a high GPA as well as just exposure to 3 or more industries, they are 8 times more likely to get a first interview and 100 times more likely to get, or like 10 times more likely to get that second interview. So it's a
Hmm.
huge just sort of boost as you just kind of get your foot in the door.
Hmm.
What they found also is that often the young people who had lower than a 2.5 GPA and who were also not as exposed, like didn't know more than 3 different kinds of jobs or industries, they were less likely to kind of make it into a job that they were seeking. And so there's this huge
Mm.
kind of disadvantage from the front end that we can, as educators, counselors,
Yep.
parents,
Yep.
intervene with and sort of say, hey, look
Yep.
at this movie we just watched. Look at how many jobs exist to just make that movie
Mm.
work, right? Look
Mm.
at
That's right.
look at you're interested in kind of learning more about cancer. Let's look at how many jobs exist beyond being a doctor, beyond being a
Right.
research scientist that goes in to helping cancer research because it has
Mm-hmm.
nothing to do with being a doctor necessarily. You
Mm-hmm.
can go in being a project manager, you can be a financial person who handles the budgets, right? There's so many jobs that we just need to make
Love that.
visible to our
Love
young
that.
people. And so
Absolutely.
that's kind of like one huge piece of this. And then once you have better clarity of where you want to go, you can also sort of think about, okay, internally as a person, what drives me? Like, what am I motivated by? And another
Mm.
thing that came out of this assessment and this work, this data, is young people who were saying, I really want a job with prestige,
Mm.
were saying, I think I want to go into HR, which HR is not like the best sort of trajectory for someone who is desperately seeking prestige. Like if we think
Mm.
about HR within an organization,
Yeah.
often they can kind of get sidelined in
Behind the
certain
scenes.
ways,
Yeah.
right? Or some of them were saying, I really want to build relationships, and they were going into finance. And it's like, well, there are different ways you can build
Yeah.
relationships, but like that's
Yeah.
not
Maybe your
maybe what you're interested
extracurriculars.
in. And then others
Right.
were saying, I really need money, right?
Yeah.
And they were picking social work. And it's like,
Yeah.
that's a
Yeah.
hard that's a hard
Right.
way to make money if that's what you're really motivated by now. And it's also important to understand, like, it's okay to be motivated by money. Like, and certain folks just kind of
Yeah.
need to get
Yeah.
beyond this kind of mental hustle and
Yeah.
this idea of surviving to just sort of be able to, contemplate other kinds
That's
of
good.
work, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just really important to understand, like, what internally is my motivation and driver, and
Mm.
is it clearly aligned to this
Mhm.
thing that I think I want to do? And I need to explore that connection, because if it's not connected, it's going to be a struggle later when someone is in a role where there's maybe where they were seeking prestige and authority and they're not feeling valued. That's
Mhm.
going to lead to, right, challenges, as they think about their sense of fulfillment. And so those are huge, like exposure, clarity, alignment drivers, and all of that came out of this research with this
Wow.
startup called Basta.
Those are, well, first of all, it makes a lot of sense, right? Just like logically, it's not even that profound. It's
Right.
just very well distilled and communicated. Um, and it just makes me think how important it is that every parent knows this.
Mm-hmm.
How important it is that every school teacher, even if your school is not requiring you to teach this, are there creative ways that you can incorporate some of this learning into your curriculum?
Yeah.
Obviously, really important for college counselors, obviously, really important for mentors. And so, this is a really critical thing you're talking about. And it kind of brings you into this like the future of work. If we're going to be exposing them, then we need to expose them to jobs that will exist in 4 to 5 years. And
Yeah.
so, can you just speak to that, before we get into our rapid fire? Like, I just would love for you to speak to, this concept of preparing for jobs that don't exist yet, right? What
Yeah.
jobs don't exist yet, and how should we be preparing for them?
Yeah. So obviously, because I don't have a crystal ball, like, I don't know what those jobs of the future are, but you can get some sense of where some of those jobs might emerge. So we
Mm,
know, just as an example, when you look at AI, there's already this new role called prompt engineering, right? We need to
hmm.
get better answers out of the
Yeah.
large language models that we're engaging with. Sometimes it's easier to look a little bit in the past. So, as an
Mm,
example, in 2014, when you looked at LinkedIn, the top 5 jobs were jobs that just didn't exist in the years, like 5 years prior. So they
mm,
were jobs like iOS or Android developer, social
mhm,
media intern, big data architect, a cloud manager,
mm,
right? These
mhm.
are all now kind of more common in our brain of, like, oh yeah, I know what big data is, kind
Yep.
of, right? I
Yep.
know
Yep.
what
Yep.
I know what a UI UX designer does. But it's hard to remember that, just back 5 years from that point in time, no one listed that as their job, right?
Yeah,
And
that's
so
right.
that's kind of the mindset we have to get into.
It's good.
If you think about today and how much change we're undergoing, there's going to be a huge emphasis on business transformation skills and different kinds of
Mm,
change management, organizational design work, because we all have to
mm,
be sort of more seamlessly attending to all this change. So we can kind of get hints of, like, where we see, and you can look at it from a labor market analytics perspective and just sort of see new kinds of terms coming out. It doesn't help you
mm.
decide, like, what the job is going to be, but it's almost less important to actually focus on what job is it that I need to prepare for. It's really those skills that I
It's
need
the
to
skills.
develop.
That's right.
Yep. And what's fascinating is it's not as technical or technological focused as we think it needs to be. Obviously, we're going to all need some technical expertise.
Sure.
We might need to know what cloud computing is. We might need to know what cybersecurity is, and we might need to know it in great depth.
Hmm.
Others, sometimes you just need like a little bit of knowledge just to be dangerous and be able to
Hmm.
kind of have conversations with the business side of the house and the engineering
Hmm.
side of the house, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
It just depends on what role you're seeking. But the thing that is just like critical, and I think you might remember this image from the book, but we all talk about kind of T-shaped learners, right? Kind of
Hmm.
having broad-based generalist understandings and those kind of human skills,
Yep.
and then some kind of technical or technological
It
expertise.
goes deep.
But
Yep.
if we think about a longer work life and a more turbulent work life where we're going to have to make more pivots than we imagined,
Yep.
we're going to have to be constantly honing those human skills. So
Yeah.
emotional intelligence, empathy, critical thinking, communication, problem solving, right? Systems thinking, those
Mm-hmm.
kinds of skills that we hope computers will be less good at or
Yeah.
machine learning will be less good at. We need to constantly be working on those skills. And then at the same time, over time, we're going to have to develop sometimes new kinds of technical or technological expertise. We're going to have to kind of continuously return to learning to skill up on some of these newfangled
Yeah.
things that we just need to
Yeah.
know how to interrogate or how to intervene with or how to complement. So it's really this kind of both and in the skills domain. It's really like, what do I need to be good at doing in order to thrive in the future? And it's
Mm-hmm.
really about those human plus technological skills. Like, how do I, if I'm finding myself in conversations where I have no idea what these people are talking about and they keep mentioning this term, my job is to go get smart on that quickly,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because
Yep.
that's likely going to, that's something that's a signal to me that I'm missing something and I need to fill in that gap, right? And we're going to
Yep.
have more and more of that over time. We're not like fully formed human beings with a college degree and that's somehow going to last us a lifetime.
Right.
It's going to be constantly kind of plugging those holes, you know, in like our Swiss cheese learning. Like we're going to have to kind of like say
Yep.
like, oh, I have a gap here. And sometimes it's going to be technical or technological. And sometimes it's going to be, I really need to work on my leadership skills because
Yes.
people are not listening, or I need to
Yes.
work on my empathy because
Mm-hmm.
I clearly am not having compassion in the right ways, right? Like, and or
Yeah.
people are not seeing that compassion in me, right? It's like
Yep.
you're going to notice the things that you need to skill up on and
Yep.
develop and
Yep.
strengthen.
Right. So I see that. I see, you're kind of speaking back to that critical skill of self-awareness, first and foremost,
Yeah.
right? Which not only is a skill, but it needs to be a rhythm that you put in. How often are you even evaluating yourself and seeing for yourself? Because you can't just rely on people to give you feedback. You got to kind of be thinking at a meta level on your own skill set, both the human and the technological. And then you need to be able to learn. You need to be like, because the learning and the information right now is more accessible than it's ever been.
Yeah.
The ability to access information you need, learn it, practice it is incredible because of technological advances. And so on an individual basis, we have to be preparing kids to learn and to learn quickly and to
Yeah.
practice and to be bad at something first and then
Yeah.
practice it and get better. And just
Yep.
like that process is going to kind of be lifelong.
Yeah, it's this really kind of finding the data and discomfort, right? Like, ooh, something makes me feel uncomfortable. That person got the raise I wanted, or I have no
Mm-hmm.
idea what that platform is. It's a signal to me to sort of act and turn that into some sort of action. I'm going to go on LinkedIn Learning. I'm going to go on YouTube. I'm going to find out what this thing is and figure out how I get better at it. Or
So good.
something just makes me feel uncomfortable. Why? Like I need to reflect on why is this making me feel so uncomfortable, right? And then you kind of go from there. And again, it is that kind of keying into what is going on internally.
Yep. I love it. Well, that's awesome. And we could talk at length. I mean, there's so much more here, and I urge everybody: long life learning, preparing for jobs that don't exist anymore. Go on Amazon, cop it, because it is absolutely critical that we're thinking this way. And really, like what you did was really just help us not what to think, but how to think about
Mm.
the future of the workforce. So I appreciate that. I want to move into our last section here, a youth development rapid fire that we kind of do with everybody. 4 questions, and we'll pop through them.
All right.
All right, let's do it. All right. So number 1, you spoke to it already with self-awareness. So I'll ask you to choose one other critical skill that every teen should master to be successful as adults.
So what's interesting is in a colleague of mine, her book called Thrivers, she talks about
Mm,
how empathy levels in children are dropping. They've
uh-oh.
dropped by 40%, and narcissism has kind of gone up by
Oh, no.
58%. Yeah. And so I would say think about ways to practice empathy. And this is, really like there's in pupil to pupil in our eyes, we respond to people when we empathize with them. So get close to someone to
Mm,
like really kind of have that moment of empathy and really understand, kind of like try to feel what it feels like to live in their shoes, right? This is something that's
mm,
missing, but it'll make you a better designer, it'll make you a better
mm.
engineer.
Come on.
Every problem that we solve starts from a moment of empathy and trying to
Yeah.
understand what the problem or pain point is.
That's so good. We're literally right in the smack dab middle of our empathy series and building it out in
Oh,
partnership
really?
with IDEOS Institute, an amazing organization thinking about
Yes.
empathic intelligence, led by an incredible woman, Christy Vines. So yes, empathy, love it. All right, number 2, what tool have you seen that you would recommend every teenager should be using? So think about like a technological tool or some app that folks need to be good at this.
Can I do a non-technological
Yeah,
tool?
yeah, you can, you can.
Just
Go
kind of
for it.
connecting back to the empathy piece.
Yeah.
So another thing that our young people are struggling to do now is to read long form content.
Oh, come on.
And so
Uh-oh.
novels, I would really encourage reading novels again, because that is actually one of the best ways to practice empathy, because
Mm,
you're literally inhabiting the mind of someone else. You're
mm,
seeing their decision making process, and you're contending with what kinds of struggles they may be feeling. There's no other way to do it other than inhabiting that kind of mind of a character or even a first person narrator. It's one of
mm,
the best ways to practice empathy, and it also kind of extends our focus of being able to read longer forms, and also deal with what sometimes we forget to do, which is being a little bit bored. Like we have to
mhm,
get through difficult things in order
mhm,
to gain new insights. And so
mm.
I would actually really kind of push novels as like Barbara Kingsolver calls it, an empathy making machine.
Wow. So binging a 5-part miniseries on Netflix doesn't count?
Does not count.
No, all
Read
right,
the
good,
read the
good.
novel version
Novels.
of it that
Novels.
inspired that.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. All right, I love it. All right, number 3. Um, you're speaking to adults who are committed to fostering the success of a teen or a group of teens. What is your message to them?
Yeah, I think um, the thing that comes to mind is you are worth it and you are worthy. So,
Mm,
one of the things I'm seeing just sort of across the board as I engage with workforce development issues and sort of the transitions of more mature learners as they build confidence to make these career pivots is there is this thing called imposter syndrome, right?
mhm,
And I think
mhm,
we all, if we don't know what it is, it's basically like feeling like you're an imposter. You're feeling like you're faking your way through it, right? Or you don't
mhm,
belong because other
mhm,
people are so much smarter and understand
mm,
this thing better than you. But it's important to understand that everyone feels that way.
mhm,
Everyone has a sense of sort of not feeling like they're meant to be in this situation. Um, and so what I would say is just as much as you may be feeling it inside, know that everyone else has had versions of this. Even the most successful people you see out there, what's fascinating is when you hear their stories, they talk about this
mhm,
sense of imposter syndrome, of feeling like, ooh, I don't this is maybe for special people and not for me. And I
mm,
really just kind of want people to understand that everyone goes through these moments of lacking that kind of confidence.
mhm,
And you're not alone, but you are
mhm.
kind of worthy, and you are worth kind of investing in and being that in, that person of who's being invested in.
I love it. That's beautiful. Well, Michelle, this has been an absolute pleasure. I'm so excited that you got on here and excited for folks to hear the insights and to start applying it. I think it's so applicable what you're talking about right now. Like it's a conversation you can have at your dinner table tomorrow, at your next mentorship session, at your
Yeah.
advisory, class at your high school, um, and again, to your point, not just with teens, right? This is
Mhm.
with everybody now. We're having to navigate a brand new world. And it would do us well to kind of hop in the driver's seat and start building some of these skills you're talking about. So
Yep.
thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much.